Hello. Hi. And for my Spanish speakers, hola. So my name is Tomas Ayuso, and I am a National Geographic Explorer. I am a Magnum Foundation Fellow and an Open Society grantee as well. And that was the one I was supposed to start with. And that's what my About Me says. I am a conflict photographer, and I've covered conflict in Colombia, Mexico, and Honduras, mostly pertaining to the drug war. So with that said, I was born in Guatemala but raised in Honduras. My father passed when I was about 20 days old, and I was raised by my wonderful mother, which she would die if she saw this, in fact. And this is me. I was a captain. Soak it in. And I was raised in Tegucigalpa. I assume, has anyone been to Tegucigalpa? Hell yes. Amazing. All right. So in Tegucigalpa, it's fairly insular. You feel that as if you are detached from the rest of the world. It's a marginal city of a marginalized country away from the global stage, as it were. But growing up, I realized that we were just in between crises. So with keeping in mind with the topic of this talk, which is flow, I chose to discuss flow as being transformative, that once you are a part of any kind of flow, you will inexorably change. And I think the starting point for this talk, to develop this idea, was the idea that you can't ever go home again, which was popularized by a man named Thomas Wolfe. Perhaps you've read his book. And it's a recurring theme in human media and fiction. Like as recently as George R.R. Martin and J.K. Rowling, Hideo Kojima, up till whoever wrote Genesis, the book of Genesis. But as a concept, as a philosophical concept, it was developed by Heraclitus, which is one of the early Greek animists, who said you can't ever be in the same river twice, which has always been like an axiom that stuck to me. That either the river has flowed and moved, or you yourself have changed to the previous time that you got into the river. By the way, this is the river Tamana in Bogota. I'm sorry, in Colombia. So, cool. But we're not going to talk about flows of rivers exactly. We're going to talk about flows of different types: the flow of time, the flows within a space, a physical space, and the flow as in described in our Honduran slang, which is kind of Spanglish, is a flow. So if you speak Spanglish, hopefully, I assume there's more people who speak Spanglish than Spanish, is like in Honduras you say, ¿Cómo está tu flow? ¿Qué tal el flow? Which means, how you doing, basically, or what's happening. But, a little bit more about me, as I left Honduras, basically, to come to the US and adopt your accent. And I lived in DC. For the people that know me, this might be a very funny picture, clearly. And I lived here. I made a life for myself. And, even my mom came to visit. I eventually lost my captain's stripes, unfortunately. And I lived in New York. I loved it. Everywhere I would see signs of Honduras. And it was like always keeping in touch with that inner Honduranness that you see everywhere. And unfortunately, I was voluntarily self-deported, as was the ominous dystopic phrase of the time that was used. And I came back and noticed that Tegucigalpa, and in fact Honduras itself, had changed completely. No longer was it detached from everything. It was, in fact, I came to learn, in between crises when I was growing up. There was political instability. Like, for instance, these men who were charging towards me swung a baton that bruised my rib cage, my bones. And it's something that I struggle with today. There have been many insurrections of people to try to take over or to defenestrate the current sitting president, who is in every sense a authoritarian. There have been, it's the slow slide towards a dictatorship, in fact, with paid members and all these different types of things. And at the human level, there was an increase as scarcity started to happen, as the inequality started to spread. So did violence follow. And this is when I was embedded with some police, and we were being shot at, so we had to run away. And no one is spared from this violence. Their children are witnesses as their neighbors are gunned down and sometimes brutalized. And I should say, consider this your content warning. I will be speaking about some pretty grim things, not for the sake of gratuity or to be morbid, but because this is what happens in Honduras. This is what happens to cause the exodus of Hondurans. This is what this boy sees, as that's, if I were to describe to you what he's looking at, I would ruin your morning, surely. And unfortunately, for many people, the act of murder became a viable way of making a living, somehow paradoxically. And it's soon followed with the spread of this just death permeating everywhere. This being the street code, or the code of the streets: hear nothing, see nothing, speak nothing. There was an enforced code of just shut up, you saw nothing. If you did, you'd end up in a coffin. This boy was not a gang member, not in any way a violent person. He was murdered just because he spoke a word that was associated with another gang. And he was brutalized, to just use a phrase and not really get into the graphic details. And this is his brother, seeing him for the last time. And if you see this, the picture that's on top of the coffin, that's the only picture that the family had of him. A picture taken when he was in first grade. His name was Leonardo. And as violence happens, there follows exile, self-imposed exile. Because what is the only thing that people can do when you try to enforce your political will through the manner of protest, and you're ignored or you're gunned down? As in that picture I showed you with the running police officers, they were firing live bullets. And it's a very terrifying moment when you actually perceive that it's lead that they're shooting, not rubber. And so people, I consider, started migrating as a way of protest, and were displaced not only to save their lives, but as a matter of protest. We will not participate in your wars, in your fights. We will not participate in the man-made economic starvation that you're putting us through, so we shall leave. And it's a matter of doing direct action protests, but not in the performative sense, in the official sense in which you cause a manifest change in both yourself, your community, and the country that unfortunately lies in tatters. So people traveled through Mexico in the attempts to go to the United States. They traveled through trains, on top of trains, and they waited at asylums, shelters rather. This man himself is a wild story. He approached me as he saw me smoking a cigarette. He asked for one. I asked him, "Hey man, where you from?" He said, Tegucigalpa. I said, "Word, where?" He said, "Downtown." I said, "Word, where?" He said, La Leona. I said, "Word?" I said, "Where?" And then he said, "My street." And I said, like, "What house?" And he said, oh, you know, the one next to the oak tree? And I said a word that I don't think I can repeat here. And I said, did you ever meet Doña Ana, my grandmother, who was very well known in the neighborhood? And said, yeah. She used to, help our family out. It's like, well, then bring it in, neighbor. And we hugged, and it was like this beautiful moment. But it was just, it showed me how we were raised 150 meters apart, not even probably. And here he was, somewhere in the middle of Mexico, being displaced, as he had been affected from all these things, by all these things that I am mentioning today. And to illustrate this, I'm going to talk a little bit about, for this talk, talk a little bit about displacement itself, so you get a sense of it. I'm going to speak about the character of Adriana and the character or the person that is Moises and their journeys and how they have changed. So the reasons why both of them leave, and many leave, is the name of is where the namesake for this project comes from, which is the right to grow old. This right, I believe, has been rendered forfeit. No, it doesn't matter how old you are, you will be. There is no protection against it. So when people leave, they take with them not their clothes, not their food, not their money. They take the most valuable thing that you can have in life, which is your loved ones, be it through kinship or that you just happen to know, be it through love of family or love of partner. And that's this is why you see families running more so than individuals, such as Mixi, who left with her child who had leukemia and sought safety in the United States to cure it. Unfortunately, her asylum case was denied. And I can't really say, I haven't been able to find her, so I regret that I cannot tell you what happened to Mixi's son. And not only do people take their loved ones, people take their Honduranness, their identity. As you see, this man has Catracho spelled out on his chest, which is the informal demonym that we refer to us as. He has the Honduran emblem on his belly, on his abs, I should say. I'm the one with the belly. And different signs of Honduranness, the flag, the origin myth that we tell ourselves. And everywhere we go, everywhere displaced Hondurans are, there is that flag, there is that idea. There is that, that's what we are. It's something that is inscribed in us. And so with displacement, you saw people just like it was a sinking ship. People found any which way, found any piece of salvage they could to leave. Such as this boy, you might think these feet are of an older man or middle-aged man. These are the feet of a boy who was 15 at the time. He had walked several hours nonstop. His group had been kidnapped, and out of fear, he ran. And I noticed when he took off his flip-flops just how damaged his feet were. And he said that this had been the first time he had sat in a long time, as he never stopped, as he was so filled with fear, with what he saw in Mexico. So people traveled through on trains rather, and I did as well. It's called La Bestia, and which translates to the beast, and it deserves its name. It is a freight train, so if you've ever been next to a freight train or try to get on a freight train that's in motion, I'd not recommend it if you don't have to. And people try to make their way through cars, migrant routes. People try to make their way through jungles, through mountain passes, just any way they could. And some people, unfortunately, would never be seen again. This is a consequence that most often isn't discussed, at least on this side of the border, what's known as desaparecidos, or disappeared, which is a very morbid Latin American phrase that people in South America are very familiar with during the crises of the 70s and the dictatorships of the 70s. And unfortunately, in Central America, we are more so becoming familiar with that now. So with that stage set of disappearances, of what Honduran displacement looks like, I will talk to you about Adriana. And Franklin, her boy. This is the very first time I met Adriana. This was outside of the migrant shelter in Tijuana, where the caravan, if you remember from last year, ended up, it was the terminus of this caravan. She fled because her son, Franklin, the sweetest boy you'll ever meet. I wish he was here, you'd be awing until your head popped off. He was being recruited by a gang to be a lookout, just the same way this boy, as you see here, is being groomed. How, you might ask, does this happen? He sees the chains, he sees the phone, he sees the fresh shirt, the Browns, by the way, and he sees he's bribed with money. Hey, go get me a Coke and I'll give you $10. And you keep the change. And little by little, he's taken in and is weaponized. And there's nothing as effective that you can see as a journalist when you go to one of these neighborhoods and you see a kid running point and who's 8 or 7 radioing in to the gunman, and you know that this kid has been rendered into an apparatus of surveillance. And this is when a child, the hand to the right, he was being given his first gun, and this is the next stage after being a lookout. You become a soldier. And eventually you and these are what the big bad gang members look like. The ones that they talk about, the one that your president is obsessed with. They're children. They're children made into weapons, which is, quite frankly, the most heartbreaking thing about this all. When you speak to them and you learn why they are like this, they are much like the people who have fled. They have been affected by the violence themselves. Another lad that was earlier in the presentation, his mother was sexually abused by a group of police officers and then disappeared. And he was forced to be he was raised on the streets. And his grandmother would feed him every so often when she had additional food, as in almost implying that he was a stray dog. Another boy was, his father was in a fight with some men who were harassing him, and being the son of his father, he came in and tried to intervene. The tormentors pushed him away. Then his father, after getting his behind beat, he went to him and beat him, and said, and he grabbed him because he was embarrassed that his son had to come to save him. And he pointed out to the dog and he said, "That dog is more of a son than mine. I don't ever want to see you again." So imagine, I don't even think that you can imagine growing up with all that hate and hurt in your heart. I should mention also that these 2 boys are now dead. The original gangs, or maras as they're called, did look like this. This is in one of their strongholds. This is a thing that not many people have ever seen. And they were deported from Southern California, as you can see. If anyone's from California, from Los Angeles and San Diego area, they fit the uniform or whatever that a lot of folks wear down there. And they were deported by Bill Clinton during his administration, and after a series of civil wars, and including a genocide happened in Central America. So we weren't really prepared to receive criminally radicalized folks who themselves had fled these wars. So refugees who, in self-defense, turned into men who eventually became psychopaths and took children and remade them and used them for their own forces. Eventually, these children growing up and being replicated. And so the cycle grinds on. And the maras, that should be said, they aren't just a gang, a bunch of dudes with guns selling dope here and there. No, there are fiefdoms within the state. They run a neighborhood as if it were a small independent republic. They impose taxes. They run government. They run it as a government. They even have development agencies as to fix up someone's house and build roads if necessary. And they also provide security, as this man was at the point in a standoff with someone at the end of the block who was looking at us with a rifle. But so with that said, now that you understand hopefully you understand the threat of what the Maras are, let's go back to Adriana. So Adriana left with her son and with a man she met, whom I shall refer to as Miguel, and they left to Tijuana. Miguel was a former gang member himself. He was imprisoned in a federal prison in the US for 21 years. And after his stretch, he was deported and went back to Honduras, a changed man. He had renounced the life that he used to have, and he told Adriana, I will take you to the border no matter what, as he had fallen in love with her. And in the process, after walking a month and a half through all these things that I told you, the jungles, the trains, the backs of trucks, suffering hunger, etc., Adriana found out that she was pregnant and she was a month and a half or 2 months in to her pregnancy. This is moments after she had gone to the OBGYN to check the status of her pregnancy. She thought she had dengue because she had all these symptoms. For Hondurans, getting dengue is pretty common. I've had it. And she found out, no, you're pregnant. And in fact, had you come a week later, you probably would have lost the baby. So it was like the moment where she just collapsed on Miguel. And it was the culmination of her displacement, to be in the arms of the man she loved, as she would say that his arms were now her home. And Miguel came to the realization that given his record, he couldn't cross the border. He would imperil Adriana's claim for asylum, as he would Franklin's. And the big bad man with all these tattoos is the sweetest man in the world. He did everything for her, as far as I know. And you can kind of see towards the right, beneath the demon figure, is a self-referential tattoo of himself. It's a reminder of who he was, he says. And Adriana never lost mind of what she wanted. She knew that if she was deported, the worst could happen. So she would dream about crossing that almost arbitrary iron fencing, but she took her time until it was her turn. And I was there when they said goodbye, and there was tears, there was pain, because it was known that this could very well be the last time they saw each other. Because if Adriana failed, they knew what waited for them back home. And so Miguel stayed in Tijuana alone. And he remembered that, he said he felt that he was back in the penitentiary. He was essentially confined to solitary, he said. But in a slight twist of fate that no one expected, not Miguel himself, his son that he had 20 days before going into prison reached out to him, found him on Facebook, and visited him in Tijuana. And this is the very first moment that they met. And it gave Miguel the opportunity to teach what it meant to be Honduran to his son that he had lost. And it was, as someone with my history, as I mentioned, it was a moment that was quite beautiful and touching. Adriana, on the other hand, she did cross, and she lives now in Southern California. And as you can see, she is very pregnant. And Franklin, the sweetest pea, is learning English so fast, you'd be spooked. And he is his mom's guardian. Wherever she goes, he goes. He's now reading the signs in English for her. He helps translate movies for her. And whenever they can, they eat Honduran food and Central American food. And whenever they can, they FaceTime Miguel. And this is how they stay in touch. Because Adriana, even though she hates to admit it, and now she knows she feels it, It might not be that she will ever see Miguel again. And this hurts because they were and remain in love. And eventually, little Leandro was born. The child who survived walking across Mexico. And Adriana was rejuvenated. She had, again, another purpose to just keep fighting. She was a mama bear, protecting her cubs. And now the three of them are in the process of attaining their asylum. Franklin, her firstborn, is on his way to being an American. He has 1 foot in already with his English. Adriana, fully Honduran, but she will find her way. And Leandro, an American citizen. And in here you have that gradient of Honduranness, Americanness, and this syncretism that happens there. And so that's the end of Adriana's story. Now I'll talk about Moises, who is, again, we go back to Honduras. He is in a city that is half rural, half urban, and is affected by the same things that I mentioned: scarcity, the lack of opportunity, violence, and the integration of gangs. As here you can see a lookout being next to the convenience store. It's just, that's how it is for these people, because the gang members didn't crawl out of a hole that was connected to hell. They are the neighbors, they are the children, they are the friends of family. And around Moises' life, the police were all over the place. Unfortunately, the police in Honduras are somewhat dirty, so they would shake down and also participate in police brutality. And unfortunately, also, in the case of Moises' neighborhood, it was used as a dumping site for bodies and body parts. His father would tell Moises, "Baby, you gotta go. You have to leave. If you stay here, I'm afraid of what will happen to you." And he said something that chills me to the bone to this day. He says, "Honduras is eating its own young. We are cannibalizing ourselves." And that's something that he repeated to Moises. And Moises was like, "I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave my guys. It's cowardly, this and that," until his girlfriend said, "I'm pregnant." So Moises said, "I'll go on ahead and scout and find a way to bring you," just all these different ideas of what he thought what asylum seeking was, until baby Jimena was born. And Moises returned for them. He didn't want to be a deadbeat dad, as his father had always been a stand-up guy for him. This is the day when they were leaving, and I joined them on their journey. Their family was with them as they traveled to the border. And I was there when they said goodbye to each other. And I let them be. I said nothing. I did not interrupt, as they themselves also knew what was at stake. This could very well be the last time they saw each other, forever. And as I said with loved ones, this is not something that is taken lightly. And as we traveled towards the border, there was all this fear that they were going to get trapped, as Moises knew that if he went back, perhaps there was going to be violence towards this person, and something that he desperately did not want to happen. And a pair of teenagers became loving parents, again, fiercely defensive of their daughter, and would do anything for the sake of her. Maya, the name of his girlfriend, just being a consummate mother from the get-go. At this point, at the Guatemalan-Mexico border, I unfortunately couldn't go in because there was a campaign against journalists, and I did not want to put their attempt to go into Mexico in peril, so I had to separate. And unfortunately, the young couple would lose their phone very soon after they crossed the border. So I felt myself what so many people in Honduras felt, the fear that they were disappeared. But they reemerged at the border a month later. I said, "Hey man, we lost your phone." I was like, "Oh God. Oh, you MFer, you. And they had made it to a border city, and they lived on top of a landfill because they are marginalized people living on the margins of society in a marginal city at the very edge of Latin America. Yet they persevered. And they remained strong. Jimena, the baby, had grown up. And Maya fully embraced the role as a mother. And at this moment, it was the first time they had communicated back home, and they FaceTimed. And it was, again, this moment of just reassurance that they were fine. And it was tough, as Maya would tell me, but the road that they took was hard, and it was just a matter of doing what they needed to do to survive. And always, at the very center of everything was Jimena, their baby. And as they walked and lived through a city that really didn't take to refugees, they made do living in their little hovel on top of a landfill. They made do. And it was something that they needed to do in order to reach asylum status. And they're still in the process of it. But it is difficult. And they are currently alone trying to do this, but hopefully the young family will make it. And I'm happy to report this picture was taken last week, and as you can see, they're healthy, they're happy, and Maya now is blonde, you can kind of say. But not everyone is as lucky as the people I've just shown you. These are the faces of what remains when someone's disappeared, when you do not know where your loved one is or where they went. These are the faces when a part of you is gone forever, and you don't know if they're alive or they're dead. They exist in this quantum state of just existence and non-existence. And it's not easy for them, as it is their waking thought and it's their sleeping thought, the one that they go away with every night. And in people who stay in Honduras, it isn't the easiest thing either. As Juancito, he was unfortunately in a case of mistaken identity. The car that he was in, he was shot over 100 times, he receiving 7 bullets. And somehow he survived without any accountability being held against the officers who left him without several organs being partially amputated. But it's not all grim and dark. There are stories of migrants coming towards the border, and like the story of Jericho, praying towards it to bring the borders down. There's stories of the Afro-Hondurans who, just by sheer character, were able to convince this neighborhood of Mexicans to believe in them and trust them and just accept them for who they were and integrate into society. There's the story of the transgender Josefina, who, after finally escaping the bondage of living in the dungeon of her father, who sexually abused her from the age of 5 and who sold her out to the patrons of his cantina to be equally abused, she had run away, made it into Mexico, and she was now free. And the moment that she was free, she was able to transition and finally express who she was as Josefina, not Jose. And I'm happy to say that Adriana is glowing, happy as she is. And unfortunately, Miguel remains alone, trying to figure out his life. And of course, the young family is happy being where they are with their child. And the families, I couldn't speak about them, but the family in Indiana who found the community, unlikely as it was in Indianapolis, of all places. I didn't even know they spoke Spanish in Indiana. So they were here celebrating the first 4th of July, and just the joy that comes with seeing fireworks, that I believe everyone here, likes fireworks. And the case of Robbie, who found his childhood girlfriend in New York And it's like, what? You're here? And they met, and the chemistry was there. And they're a beautiful couple. And or the case, you know, and so like, yes, they're always like looking forward. This is Jimena's first time looking across into America, and she could see her parents' excitement. Therefore, she shared it, and she was, "Ooh, I'm gonna go," you know. And there's all these stories of love and hope that are shared across the displacement. It's not all horror, because the vast majority of people who attempt these things, who leave, yes, they leave under horrible consequences, but because of the resilience of their spirit, they're able to maintain this happiness, this joy. They're able to be complete as they travel with their loved ones. They are alive. So it's not that they are thrown away, cast aside, and miserable. No, they resisted, they survived, and now they thrive. And thank you. Oh, thank you.